My name's Beth. I am the head of growth at Flexa, where we verify flexible workplaces and help companies build employer brands. We talk about flexibility all the time, and increasingly that topic comes towards mental health and people's lifestyles as well. And I've got Kenny with me as well, also very patient, bearing with us as we've gone through all of these technical issues. So Kenny, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Beth. I'm just pleased everyone gets to see me not in a black PVC dress, which across the internet, which is quite fun. Yeah, so I'm head of commercial growth at Oliva. Oliva is Europe's #1 mental wellbeing platform. Don't take my word for it. Check G2, check Google reviews. But ultimately, we help workplaces create great environments for their individuals through lots of different ways. I might mention some of them on this call, but I'll try not to self-promote too much. And looking forward to it.
Awesome. And I think it's important for us to start with saying that neither of us are therapists or psychologists. Like, we're very much coming at this topic as people who are, so Kenny and I both work in growth, which means that we're often people responsible for kind of pushing forward the speed and the pace of a business. And that can often be associated with stress at work, although it doesn't have to be. There are obviously ways that you can grow a business efficiently and quickly without it having to be stressful. But I think that what we really want to dig into today is how managers of teams and HR and people who help managers be better managers can tackle this at the root cause. So I think it'd be really useful. Kenny, you had a really great definition of burnout. If we could start there, that'd be great.
Yeah, no, and a really good point as well around our view on this. But I think the next session should be about how you do scale a business without stress, because I'd love to hear it. But yeah, so burnout. So my background, I've been in HR technologies for close to 20 years. I spent the last 3.5 years in mental wellbeing. I think 3 years ago, when I entered this space, kind of like just when about pre-pandemic, burnout was really like aligned to workplace. It was just the workplace. Actually, the World Health Organization attributed it just to the workplace. That's changed now. When you read a lot of the writings and journals on burnout, it's very much now blurred. So burnout is essentially when individuals get to a point where they're either detached, they're starting to show symptoms that is caused by prolonged stress. And that doesn't just have to be in the workplace. I think the #1 or one of the most impacted is working mums. So I think that tells us that's not just because they're in stressful work environments, it's because their working environment at home is pretty stressful. And being a dad and a loving partner, I see that firsthand. So I think what we're seeing now is that whole blurred lines, and the pandemic definitely fast forwarded that. And I think that then changes the way that we have to look at that. So just understanding that definition and how burnout occurs helps us as leaders, helps us as I said, in HR functions to really support individuals as they try and navigate this fairly complex life that we all live in.
Yeah, when we were prepping for this workshop, and Kenny spoke to me about this for the first time, what I thought was so interesting for managers is, I think we often associate people, and burnout's obviously one extreme of it, right? But everybody has stress, everybody has mental health, whether that's good, bad, neutral. And I think when we talk about it at work, there's an assumption that I definitely made that was, oh, well, someone would be stressed if they had a higher workload or if it was a particularly stressful time at work. But by doing that, it's clear that I was missing a whole portion of this. Somebody could have the exact same amount of work that they've always had, but their personal situation has changed. And that just means that then the work becomes overwhelming. It's not that we have this one cup of energy that we can use at work and another one at home. It's all coming out of the same bucket. And I think that that's something that, managers, especially people who are great at building good relationships with their teams, it's so important to be able to tackle that. So we actually asked a question on LinkedIn last week, which was deliberately quite controversial, and there were only 2 answers. And the question was, who is responsible for mental health in the workplace? And you could only pick yourself or your manager. Deliberately binary. And so 65% of people, we had thousands of people respond to this, 65% of people said that it was the individual. So it's each of our own responsibility to be responsible for our mental health. And only 35% said the manager. And again, Kenny, when we spoke about this, you had a really great take on this response and how that should be handled at work.
Yeah, definitely. So it's a really good question, and it's one that is coming up time and time again for us here at Oliva. We're obviously speaking to a lot of businesses around mental health. How do you create the right environment? And I think what's important is let's think about this in a physical health way. You break your leg outside work, or even at work, it can happen. The way you then look after it thereafter is really down to you. You're accountable for that, and you're expected to look after it that way. And I'm a big believer that we should create parity in mental and physical health. I think it would help the narrative, it would help the conversation really fast forward even further. So when we think about that, I do think there's a role for the manager and there's a role for leadership in this. But what is that role? It's definitely not accountable, because that's too much. And we start to, there's really blurred lines there about how that's managed out. Responsibility can be one as well. I think we can then be responsible for it. So when we think about the impact that we have on one another as a leader, as a manager, how we create processes in a business, yeah, it's our responsibility to create an environment which is healthy. So I think that's where the line is drawn for me. I think we look at it that way. And if you can create a culture of accountability to your individuals and make them and help them become understanding of how to be accountable for their mental health, they can look after that bit. And ways of doing that is simply making sure they have the right tools, making sure they're aware, making sure they're educated to understand when they're starting to feel the signs of things such as burnout, for example. Then you go back up into the business and think, well, what can the manager do? And there's lots of little ways how the manager can then look out for these signs, and they can take some responsibility to keep an eye on things changing, or even the environment changing. But I think that's the two words that kind of land well for me. Is accountable is the employee, and responsible is the employer. Like we want to try and make sure we're not responsible or irresponsible, should I say, and which results in things like burnout, as we're talking about today.
I think it's a really lovely way to frame that. The accountability is on the individual, but the responsibility is on the employer. I think that makes it a really easy, clear way to see how the difference, where that's different and how we can all play a different role. I think there's a lot about building those relationships way before there are any sort of issues that come up that really help you to be able to navigate that when it comes up. So into kind of our main body of questions, everybody always has mental health, right? That's not a kind of do or don't thing. We always are in a spectrum of mental health and how we're feeling. But do you think there are some unique stressors or unique challenges that are particularly relevant to this moment in time in 2023?
Yeah, for sure. And this isn't just my own view. As we said at the beginning, I think we all have our own views on this, but what we're seeing here again, Oliver, without too many plugs, but we capture a lot of data. And the things which we're certainly seeing now is obviously the cost of living crisis is one piece. And I call this a perfect storm, which we're seeing currently in the UK. So we have the cost of living crisis, which is just, we won't go down that rabbit hole just now, but we know that individuals are finding it harder. We then, on the flip side, is we have businesses which are quite openly talking about trying to do more with less. We've unfortunately, especially in the tech space, and I'm not saying it's just attributed in the tech space, it's very much many industries have had layoffs recently. Goals are still as high as ever, growth plans are still as high as ever. And what we're seeing is that perfect storm where people are finishing work and they're going into that stressful environment of the home life, which could be that driven by the current economy. And then even from a macro level, I think it's some of the toughest trading conditions the UK has seen as well. So you're getting all these different stressors, and it really is a point where finding that moment, and going back to the definition of burnout, is finding that moment where you can take yourself out of that stressful situation is getting a little bit more difficult. It's getting difficult for many. And whether that is I don't think that it chooses who it picks on. I think that's everyone, every demographic, they can be finding it very difficult just now. And we, as employers, have to be really cognizant of the fact that's happening. And Yeah, as I said, we're not accountable, but we can think about how we support. So there's definitely a lot more stressors out there. And it's a difficult time. Like we have to be resilient and try and be resilient. And there's certainly ways we can, but we have to also be very aware that this isn't the easiest time we've probably seen from a workplace perspective. And the amount of change, humans don't like change. We're not built for change, like sudden changes. And we've had a lot of them as well. So what we're seeing is a lot of businesses now, those who are conscious of the situation are now taking action around those things because they realize that there's a lot of pressure on their workforce right now.
Yeah, totally. And the other thing that always comes to mind when I'm thinking about mental health and changes in the workplace is that, 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, managers and HR teams and people teams weren't involved in these conversations of mental health, or if they were, it was only in the very extreme moments, whereas now it's such a common topic in the workplace, and we've got HR teams being trained as mental health first aiders. We've got people using platforms like Oliva for mental health at work. We've got people focusing on better work-life balance. Like, all of these conversations are starting to happen, and it's a huge amount of pressure, I think, that's been put onto HR teams and managers to deal with this, often without any training at all. And it must be really difficult to navigate.
Yeah, I think if I was given, say, the cost of living crisis, if I was given £5, not a penny, for every time I heard about people leave managers, yeah, that is a statement, and it's kind of true. It is. Like, we know the fact that people leave managers, not companies. But we have a lot of managers in the first time in their roles, and they're maybe early in their career, they lack that experience. Like, I think when I moved into management and leadership, I was taught how to run a one-to-one and a employee review type thing. I was never really taught about how to manage someone who was having a very difficult time outside work and having to bring that into the workplace. So there's a lot of pressure on managers and a lot of pressure on HR. I think that we all have to be very aware of that and start really thinking about, like, how do we train those soft skills? How do we really help people spot situations? How do we help managers have a discussion and even open up that conversation? Because if you can't open up that conversation, why would an employee tell you that anything's wrong? If you didn't have the skill set, why would they come into the office and share with you and be in confidence that something was happening in their own life that was making them struggle and more potential to burnout, for example? So there's a massive shift. I think we're seeing it a lot now. I think we're seeing it definitely a rise in manager training, but I still think we really need to focus on the soft skills. How to ask the question when you spot a sign that someone might not be at their best. Those are the skills, I think, which are kind of missing in the workplace in some ways, but still more prevalent now and more needed now than they ever have been.
Yeah, definitely. And I actually, I did, I promise we work with other people, not just each other. I did a panel for Oliva over the summer, which the topic was about manager mental health. And at the time when I got asked to be on the panel, I was like, I don't think about that at all. And then actually, there's a real, a lot of managers and HR teams are falling through the gaps in terms of people paying attention to their needs. And if you're a good manager, you're always thinking about how can you get as much out of the way of your team as possible to be able to get them to be in a place where they feel like they're thriving and they're happy and they're enjoying their work. And often, because you don't have a magically expanding time, that means taking it on yourself. And I think that that's a really underspoken about part of the mental health situation, and managers and HR teams probably at risk of burnout as well, definitely as much as everyone else, if not more. But so when you're talking about the ability to have those early conversations when you spot an early sign of burnout, what kind of things would you be looking for amongst your team or your peers?
Yes, there's a few levels to it in that question. So I think the first thing is there's the ability to connect, that you have to be able to connect or really understand the individual. When you do and you understand the individual, your team, and you then start to spot the signs, you can tell when someone maybe isn't themselves. So maybe their work rate is changing, maybe their work quality is changing. spotting those signs, and even just we all have access to diaries now. We can see people's diaries, and I mean, I'm very lucky. I have a team who look out for me, and they can see when my diary looks unmanageable, and they'll call it out and be like, "Yeah, things are starting to run away a little bit here." But looking at things such as those little signs, there's just times that you can tell when someone is flat out. You can tell where they're heightened emotions. Let's say they can see that they are reacting rather than being proactive. And that's when we start to see that people are really starting to get to that point. And that's where the interjection, or the sort of stepping in and just double checking on them, like making them realize that this isn't about a telling down, a talking down. This is really about, this is just a check-in. This is a wellness and a well-being check-in. It can take a while for some people to get used to that, especially different generations can find it a bit strange that someone's asking them, like, are you doing your job the right way? That's not what we're trying to do. There's lots of different ways to go about that, but I do think that there's those little telltale signs that, especially when we're working remotely, can be quite hard at times to see. We can sometimes put on a really hard front for that 30-minute Zoom call, but sit back and we're just like floundering away. But those little signs, like how people react to the shortness or longness of their messages, how that's changed over time, and just by being a leader or a manager who's connected to that individual already, you should start to see those signs and the little warning signals that are there for you to step in. That's for you to try and support.
Yeah, and it's about knowing your team's baseline then, right? So we work flexibly, we're remote first at Flexa, and something that I really try and work on in my own development as a manager is sometimes I can get a bit carried away with what's going on, and I'll be like, well, I know that this needs to go out and we're excited about this and this project's moving forwards, and there's a few of my team on the call, so they can call me out, and something I really try and do is make time to check in, and I really try and check myself if I get onto a one-on-one, and I don't say like, oh, how are you? How's your weekend? What's been going on? Like, that is really valuable time. But definitely sometimes if things are hectic and I'll launch straight into, something about work, and then I think you're in such a worse position to be able to recognize signs of someone needing help. And the earlier you can have these conversations and the earlier you can build these relationships, it's easier to tackle that when it happens. A phrase that I really like to use, talking about managers who have remote teams or flexible teams, is intentional management. I think that not always, but being in an office can mask a lot of poor management quite easily, because you've got that constant interaction. You can see if somebody's acting a bit off, or they're kind of coming in late when they're normally always on time. There's a lot more visibility. It's a lot easier, I think, to be a good manager when you see your team in person every day, but you're not actually being a good manager, you're just giving that illusion. Whereas if you've got a distributed team, there's a lot more intentionality behind the way you set up your calls, your processes, and also how you spend that in-person time together, and how you navigate that quite complex thing of having a personal relationship and a professional relationship with someone. And I think whenever we're talking about mental health, that boundary becomes harder to navigate, which I think is a challenge for a lot of managers.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I cast my mind back. I remember my first ever job in sort of a high pressure environment, and I still look back in this chap who was my manager at the time. It was a fairly tough environment. It was you'd probably class it close to boiler room, but he had a way of doing it as well. He was very intentional. He used to take me onto the fire escape. I'm that old. He probably took me onto the fire escape that he used to smoke on. But he'd take me into the fire escape, and it'd be that arm room machine. Like, is everything all right? Like, just want to double check. And I always look back on that now, because I think there still is an issue about sort of masculinity in the workplace that some people but he managed to bridge that gap. I thought it was very, very well done of him. But there's ways, and I think that's a really good, the way you've described it is this: how do you get close, but obviously not too close, but you have this tiny boundary. The way I've seen it done really well is almost everyone having their own manual, your ways of working. So when you join a company, everyone will share their ways of working. How do they prefer to work? How do they usually work? What's their style? What's their rhythm? And so on. It's very good for hybrid working. having this manual and having set questions, everyone can have a bit of a laugh at it because there's a few funny questions in it, but having that in the onboarding, you as a leader, I can then look at that and I can understand when someone isn't in their own rhythm, when they're doing things, it's generally not really their work, it's not the kind of stuff that they enjoy, because that does two things for me. One, it tells me when they're probably stressed, they're going to be under more pressure than usual because that's not that individual's way of working. But we've been very conscious, like you said, we've made a statement to each other, almost like an agreement. Obviously, you can't come in and just say, yeah, I'm going to work like completely different hours from everyone. I'm like nocturnal and stuff. You could do that if it works in your working environment, but we can't take it that far. But just that manual and that way of working, it allows you as a leader to understand, or a HR function to understand, like when people are out with their comfort zone and under more pressure than usual. And just by having that, you can then start thinking about, well, how do you support that person? Because we all have to do stuff outside our comfort zone. A good example of that, I had a webinar with a client in the legal industry who talked about you have to work nights sometimes. Sometimes you work through the night in the legal industry. It's just accepted. Work-life balance can be hard at that point. But it's how do you then support after that? Like make sure they get their breaks because you know that person's been doing something out with that. So there's that piece around understanding the working rhythm of your team, understanding what puts them under pressure, and then making sure that you're supportive thereafter and creating some kind of recharge point. They do it in lots of industries, gaming, tech, they'll have them. But I do think in every day we should be thinking as a leader, right, I know that employee's been in a hard sprint for the last 3 weeks or the last week, whatever. Let's give them that moment. Reach out to them, say, look, you've been at it for the last day, make sure you take tomorrow morning off or whatever, like recharge your batteries. And I think that's that conscious part, is like really looking out for the signs. But before the signs are there, just understanding like your working rhythms of your teams, I do think goes a long way.
Yeah, definitely. Just being really intentional with it. So I love the manuals. We do those at Flexa as well. Kind of like a personal instruction book. But the way that I think that they are underused is they're not updated regularly enough. Most people have these as a part of the onboarding process when you first join a company. And my worry about them is that they can be quite restrictive and if you don't update them, they don't reflect the growth that we all go through, or we should all hopefully be going through as over the course of a year in a job. You know, you learn new things about yourself and you learn, oh, actually, I thought I liked working in this way, but it was because I didn't have the support, or I didn't have the knowledge, or whatever it was, or I actually now have a kid or a dog or whatever it was that means that your way of working changes. So I think it's really good habit to, I love the concept of them, and I think that it's probably something that we all need to make sure we're maintaining. Mm-hmm. But apart from that, what other kind of cultural things could you put into place in a company to really encourage this environment where someone feels like they can share with you?
Yeah, the environment where people share. So I'll talk about my own experience, and rather than thinking through how we just speak to clients. But I do. I'm a firm believer that whether we like it or not, as in leadership, you do role model. Like you will create reactions and you'll create people to act a certain way. I think that being very open about your boundaries is one way. So like sharing that you have your boundaries, everyone should have them 100%. So I think leadership should be the first to admit that. But then what falls off, I think where it goes wrong is that leadership will say they have these boundaries, and the boundary could be, I don't work weekends, I don't that. But then people see you on Slack, they see you doing things and whatever. I think you then, and I try and make this a habit myself, is if I have gone beyond my boundary, I'll call that out the next day. I'll say, people might have seen me online, this was because this happened, and this meant that I would go out my boundary for this thing. It was like, it was ranked high enough in my priorities that I had to step in and do something. And I think creating that environment where people feel open, that they can talk about their own boundaries and they can talk about what caused them to go beyond that is one I think is it works well. The other one, which I think it gets people talk about this role modeling in a certain way, especially in leadership, but role modeling doesn't land for me when someone says they're a master at it now. Yeah, I used to have stress, but now I'm totally fine now. I've got on top of it. I've done some therapy and like I don't get anxiety anymore. It's like, right, well, that just makes everyone else feel a little bit shit if they're still really struggling with that. So I think it's like role modeling without masculinity, but role modeling without this whole bravado that, yeah, I managed to overcome it and like I'm a bit of a genius on it. like it just doesn't land. I think we've just got to like always stay vulnerable in that, and be open to these to the fact that we're not all perfect, and we're still working through things in some ways. And I think it does come back to the burnout piece. I think it's just be careful what we celebrate, like be careful what we congratulate, because it's all too often do we see burnout, which is very prevalent in environments or industries where people celebrate just that whole continuous work ethic. I spoke to a consultancy last week, and he shared with me burnout's part of the job. It's going to get us eventually. And I'm like, whoa. It's like, I can't imagine having that conversation with a grad, for example, who's coming into the industry. And funnily enough, they do have challenges getting grads into the industry. So it just be like resetting that. I think that's important, but just thinking about what we celebrate and what we talk about in that way can go a long way in people sort of looking out for themselves and creating that environment which is a little bit more vulnerable in that sense. It's really difficult to get, and as I said, I'm on that journey myself. I'm sort of trying to create those environments, but like thinking it through that lens has certainly helped me, and I think it's I've seen it work in other ways in other places as well.
I think that's really helpful. So we've got, being very conscious about what you reward and what you celebrate, and we do want to celebrate hard work, but we don't want to celebrate burnout, right? And there's a definite difference between the two. And acknowledging even in your senior leadership team and as a manager that, actually this is what I'm working on, or I'm struggling with this. And I think the first point you made about boundaries is really topical for us, because I think about this a lot. And so I have a bunch of different things going on, right? I'm full-time at Flexa. I also angel invest, and I coach and consult startups. And sometimes I worry about talking about that, because I get people saying things like, oh my God, I want to be able to do that, or I wish I could do all of that. How do you fit it all in? And so I'm very conscious to always make a point of, my life doesn't look like a lot of people, right? I don't have kids. I live by myself. I don't have the responsibilities and the personal stress that some people have. And also that means that sometimes I will, if it's summer and there's a beautiful Wednesday evening, I might go and play a round of golf. But I probably will also work on a Sunday morning. And that's a choice that I've made. And I'm also, one of the things that I really try and do is, just because something's in my head and I've decided to act on it at that time. So sometimes I'll send my team thoughts over the weekend, or just reviewed this for you, let me know what you think. And I always try and remember to put, you do not need to look at this now. Monday is fine. I hope you haven't even seen this, because I want to make it really clear that that's my choice to build my life and design my life in that way. It does not mean that anybody else has to emulate that. And really my job is to respect other people's way of working, because you have to trust that if you've hired smart people, they know how to get the most out of themselves. And your job is just to be there to support that, not to dictate, I do it this way, so you must as well.
Yeah.
I've got one more question for you written down in my, I've actually got loads more, but I want to make sure that we have time to get questions from people on the call. So if anyone wants to pop in some questions, if you do that now, and then I will try and find the Q&A section and come to those in a second. But Kenny, the last thing that I would really like to ask you is, if you've noticed that somebody is showing signs of burnout or stress, and you're pretty confident that this is what's going on, how do you approach them without it feeling judgmental or also difficult for yourself? Because it can be a hard conversation to start to have with someone. Do you have any advice of how you would go about that conversation?
Yeah, it can be a super hard conversation to have. You've got to think about what they're trying to achieve, and you've got to become that coach. As a leader, you can't step into their private life. It's very difficult. You can signpost, you can advise, you can try and make sure they're seeking support if there's something that is happening. when I've seen it in the workplace, I always just ask for some time. Let's get like free time. We'll have a very personal conversation just about how things are going. Like, I don't want to know about work right now. Just how are you feeling? Like, what's happening? And I'd take the same approach as you said, Beth, about like really find out how someone is. Then I go into coaching mode a little bit. Like, what are we trying to achieve right now? Like, what is the goals? Like, what are we trying to do? And like, how are we trying to get to that point? How are we getting from A to B? And is there a way that I can help get from A to B a little bit easier than where we're going at the moment? If it's as simple as that, where I'm seeing someone really struggling with stress, I just try and make them try and realize we're here to support them going that journey where they're trying to get to, which is stressing them. If it's a signal which I've seen, such as their behaviour on messaging or emails, whatever it may be, I will kind of call out, just saying, like, I've just seen a slight change. Like that to me, as a human being, always as a human, not as a leader, that was me. That I've got a bit of a concern. I'm a bit worried about you. Are you all right? Because I've seen something. I try not to take "I'm your manager" approach. It's just I've seen something as a human, and it made me think, right, okay, are you all right? I want to double check on you. I've had many of those conversations, and they tend to land well on that checking in as a human, and being a human first and a manager second is what tends to get the best reaction. And sometimes that reaction as a manager can be quite difficult to respond to, because it can be one off the person sort of opening up and maybe for the first time about something, and that can be a challenge in itself. Hence the reason managers need to get training. But just being that human in that first approach is what makes a difference. There's actually a lot of research around this as well, about how human-centered leadership creates loyalty and increases discretionary effort where an employee wants to go the extra yard. So learning to be the human, learning how to open the conversation, being a human rather than a manager, is the way I'd advise to approach it.
Yeah, I love that. And again, comes back to that, always trying to ask how you are at the beginning of a conversation, so then you have that foundation to build on. It's not totally out of the blue when you notice something's wrong. I also really like your point around trying to collect and use examples. I think that often some people are incredibly self-aware, and some people are still on that journey of figuring out themselves and knowing themselves. I think we're all still on that journey, always. But it can be really, really helpful when you're giving someone feedback or you're noticing something in their behavior to give them examples, because I think it really helps anchor that in their mind and helps them question themselves of,
yep.
Oh, was I just a bit grumpy? Did I need to eat? Or is this a pattern? Or is this something deeper than that? And to be able to challenge it in different ways. I love that. So we've got a few questions in the question box. The first one, which is kind of still on this topic of approaching these conversations and checking in. Carol is asking, how often do you recommend you check in with employees? And should this be done directly or via a third party? I have one opinion on this, which I'll share before I bring it back to you, Kenny, which is I have a bit of an issue with anonymous feedback between a manager and someone they manage. I can totally understand where anonymous feedback has its place, or anonymous conversations have a place, particularly when people feel they're at risk of being discriminated against, or they're really finding it hard to share with you. But I find that if you're you don't want to be in that situation as a manager where someone feels like they cannot come to you and share it with you because they feel like you're going to judge them or something is going to happen. There's obviously a fear there. Comes back to what you said at the beginning of, why would anybody come to you with a problem if they don't think you might be able to help with a solution? And I find that a really difficult thing to get around as a manager. And so I don't love using third-party tools or anonymous tools to check in with team members, unless they're really needed. And I think that if you get to that point, that's better than nothing, absolutely. But really, we should be building this two-way vulnerability that means that people feel like they can come to you directly. And something that I really try and do to encourage that is not every week, because I don't want to make my team check-ins about me. But I really try on a sort of quarterly basis to share with people I manage what I'm working on and where I think I've got space to improve, because I think that that's really important. You never want to be in a situation, like you said about the role modeling, where you've got a group of people in a business who are like, well, we're perfect, and everyone else then feels like that's the standard you have to meet, and it's also just not true. But how do you structure that with your team? Like, how often do you check in with them? Is it very direct? Do you use any other tools?
Yeah, anonymous is okay on an aggregated fashion, so like employee experience type stuff. So for me, it's a last resort in any kind of feedback. It can sound like bullying if you're using it. It's just got so many negative connotations, and it can create more anxiety than is already in the workplace. So yeah, definitely steer away from that. And as I said, so zooming out a little bit, I think from a organizational structure and processes, I think anonymous, aggregated, high volumes of data work. I think it helps us understand where we're creating more pressures in the workplace. That's fine. I'm a very direct person. I've had that feedback, but I'm very driven by my value system is very driven by people. So I tend to just check in with people as we go. Everyone knows that if I catch them in a virtual corridor such as Slack, I'll probably ask them how they are, what happened at the weekend. We have every Monday we have a stand up in our team, and we talk about the highlight of our weekend and the focus for our week. It's a personal thing and a professional thing, and it takes us 30 seconds. It's amazing what you gather from it. Like, we get to find out about people's kids, their dog, their favorite foods, and it's just a way to see. You do get to. I hope my team are watching this. They probably are, but you can see how they are. You get to see how they are straight away and how they're feeling. And that to me is enough just to get going. And then we have like various one-to-ones and things. But I'm just I think we tend to have a rhythm that I just check in when we're passing. We've got a chance, we're maybe collaborating. I think it becomes too structured otherwise. I think if we're doing things, we do 360 feedback, and they're not anonymous. We do that every quarter, and I'm a big believer in them as well. I think create a culture of feedback is super healthy.
Yeah.
But I always get more just from catching up with people.
Yeah, I guess it changes as well as your business changes.
Yeah.
The bigger you are, the more sort of structure you tend to put in place. And for me, we do. I have a weekly one-on-one with everybody that I manage, which is usually about like, how can we move the work forwards? How can we progress things? But often they end up being, depends. Sometimes 10% chat, sometimes 80% chat. And I think having those meetings, regardless of whether you've got, some real kind of work stuff to get through, or if you're just having a catch up, is super important. And the Flexa Slack channel is constantly going. I have to mute it whenever I'm on a call. So that's really great for us. We're kind of always staying checked in, and then we meet up in person once a month, which I think really helps as a distributed team. That definitely helps us. Mm-hmm. So Alex, your question about, do you have a dummy example? So we use Manual of Me. Do you guys use the same, Kenny, or do you make your own?
We don't. We created our own, but I think, Alex, I have a LinkedIn long post on it that I'll share after the call. I'm pretty sure I do. If I don't, we'll create one, but I'm sure we've got one.
Excellent. Okay, we will get a example to you. Absolutely. Natalie, I really liked your question around, so how can you best support someone coming back to work after a period of burnout? Kenny, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think for anyone coming back to work, we need to be super conscious about the reasons they were off, not just burnout, any sort of long-term absence. And we need to be empathetic and sort of understanding. Understanding what led to it is like really important without going through the motions again, but creating the environment and doing, as I said, the accountability piece and responsibility, making yourself responsible for how do we support that individual. Burnout is often misdiagnosed as anxiety as well, but there's no reason why someone who's coming back from burnout couldn't be supported by a coach, by a mentor of some sort. So we'd look to do that as well. And whether you're doing that externally or internally, would be a huge support for anyone coming back from long-term absence. So as I said, I think the characteristics of how we approach it would be similar to anyone coming back into the business, thinking about their workload, thinking about how you ramp them back into the business. Communication is super important about them and how they're going to be working and how you communicate with them. And then finally, that one-to-one support, which doesn't always have to be the manager. It doesn't have to be a mental health champion either, because I'm still on the fence slightly about how we work with mental health champions, not Oliva, but just how they work in general. But I think having a mentor or a coach, I think, works really well. So obviously internally or third party, and supporting that individual come back and manage and get back up to speed. There's nothing wrong with what they've been off for. It's about just helping them come back up to speed of the business. It's coming back into any company. I've done it from a paternity leave. It can be pretty daunting and pretty hard work. So just think about that as well.
Yeah, definitely. That kind of, for a very practical ramping back up, you know, is it that someone wants to come in a couple of days a week at first and then come up that way? Or is it that you're just much more conscious about their workload, or make sure they have extra support? And the other one that I think is really important for, it's probably, I mean, it depends on the setup of your company, but it's either something that HR would do and definitely involve the manager or the manager themselves. I think it's really important to have a private one-on-one conversation with the person who's coming back. And this is very specifically if they're coming back from burnout or any other mental health issue, and really understand from them. And you should ideally do this before they leave, so you've got an understanding of what you should tell the team. And just get really clear with them on what do they want to tell people, what are they comfortable about talking about, what are they not, because they're going to get questions of why were you off, what happened, how are you feeling, and really helping them navigate those conversations, because I think that can be one of the most daunting things about coming back after some time off is, God, is everyone going to ask me about it? I don't know if I want to share this or that. And between the two of you, the manager or your HR team and the individual themselves, just really reassuring them, like, what you want to share is what we will go by, and you know, we'll respect your boundaries and your privacy, and really making sure that they know that if they want to be as open and honest as they can be, that's fine. If they want to be more private about it, that's also fine, and helping them navigate that, and also protecting their space. Mm-hmm. You know, if you find that they are getting questions that make them feel uncomfortable, being ready to protect their space and hold that for them, I think is really important. I'm going to go as maybe a last question, maybe one more, to David, who's asked a really good question from the other side, which we haven't talked about very much, which is, how would you start a conversation with your manager about mental health and burnout if it's not openly spoken about in your culture? You must get people coming to you at Oliva with this problem, Kenny, surely.
Yeah, it's a really good question. There is the most obvious one in the UK is when we think about men's mental health, but having worked globally, and Oliva is global, we find that there's certainly cultures which find even using the word mental health is just not used. It can be emotional health in the phrase and so on. I think it's a really difficult one to answer for everyone, because every culture will be different in that sense. But I think we've got to then position it about the accountability and responsibilities. Again, you're accountable for how you're feeling. You're accountable for, are you at your best? Are you able to perform? Because that's what ultimately this horrible trade-off that happens in society is, you get paid to come in and perform. It's just the way the world is made. Coming in and having that conversation about whether that you're not able to operate at your highest because something isn't working for you. That's I think the way the conversation needs to start, because if something's going to go wrong and you don't call it out, and then your manager then turns around and says you're not doing your job properly, then we all know that there could be longer term or longer issues around that. So it's about, and this might not be the most easy way to put that, but it's about relating this back to your performance. Like, my performance isn't great at the moment because something just isn't sitting well with me. Depending on the culture we're talking about would depend on the language you would use, but relating it back to performance, because your manager, as we talked about, they're responsible for some things, but they're kind of accountable for your performance. That's where accountability comes in as a manager, because your manager will be questioned why you're not performing well. So you have to try and raise awareness of that in some way. That is a very broad answer to that, and there will be different approaches to that, but I still think it's where where you feel the culture isn't in the business to talk about that, I think you've got to relate it back to your performance, back to you not feeling yourself and not feeling 100%, because there's lots of reasons from a mental health standpoint why you might not be performing. And then if your manager will care about performance. So I think that's the approach to use in that sense. I hope that does help, David.
I think that's a really good point. It's kind of finding the doorway, the gate that your manager will understand, or the company culture will understand, for you to use to open that conversation. And then there's also maybe something here in if you're feeling that in an organization, or if one person's feeling that, you're probably not the only person who feels that. And if you've got great relationships with your peers, it could be helpful to, crowdsource a little bit of backup. And, if you've got enough of you, and I think this is probably, maybe this is stereotyping, more typical in more traditional industries, with people who are older and who maybe mental health conversations at work is not the norm. And so I think that it can feel very threatening, but I like to assume the best in people and assume that they are not, they're not dismissing this because they don't care, but they are overlooking it because it's not something that has been part of the culture for so long. So being able to have a sort of steering group of younger employees within the organization who can help bring up these issues is a great idea. Could even be a way to, speak to a HR team and say, we would love to put together a focus group on this and see if there are other people who feel this, or maybe this is an opportunity for an anonymous survey, saying, could we send out and ask, how do people feel about stress at work? And do you feel able to talk about this? Do you feel like it's impacting your performance? Try and find those gateways in. But that's a lot of responsibility to take on, to change a company's culture, especially if you're in a position where you're not feeling great. So I realize that's not always going to be an option, but maybe something to advocate for well before you get into that position, or on behalf of someone else. But yeah, thank you guys so much. And thank you, Kenny, for joining us. I really, really appreciate everybody's patience with our technical glitches and switching over to Google, who saved the day. Well done, Google. But yeah, thank you so much. And we will follow up with a recording of this. And we will also follow up with, Kenny's going to produce a manual of me style, not them because they already exist, but a kind of personal instruction manual template or post that we can send around as well. Thank you guys so much for joining us. And Kenny, thank you for the second hour that you've given us to do this.
That's cool. No, thank you, everyone. It's been fun. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Thank you so much. Bye.